this, what is it, 20th of April in 2025. Sorry, 2026. Now, this is going to be a very, I think, important video in this particular series as I attempt to outline chapter 4 in Gregory Shaw's Theurgy and the Soul, Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. So what I'm going to attempt to do here is to, well, let me lay it out briefly. We have a bit of a situation, in case anyone hasn't noticed. It's an enlightenment or bust situation. We're in a moment of transition and transformation in which the future of life, not to say the least about the future of humanity, is very much at stake. And essentially, it's a situation where we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And so the future for everyone, right, and the whole community of beings, let's say, around us, the natural world as well, is very much at stake unless we can work out how to bring ourselves through cultural processes to greater awareness of our situation. So it's an enlightenment or bust situation. It's a bit of a bottleneck transition that has been expressed as a combination of the meta crisis and the meaning crisis, which I won't go on about here. But roughly speaking, the diagnosis is, given the situation that we have, what we ought to do is to facilitate the naturally emergent process of collective forms of identity coming into greater awareness. So I'm talking about collective awakening processes. And again, I'm not going to defend today why I think that could be beneficial. I think I'm happy to simply tie human survivability to the byproducts of greater awareness. And I think it's pretty clear to me that greater awareness can help us. What I'd like to explore is, like, once we have that rough prescription, how is it possible to actually wake ourselves up? How can we bring ourselves to greater awareness without losing our individuality? I think we reach this place of recognizing that it's this duality of individuation, so the development of our individual souls, and participation in group states, retribalization, in a word. If we can do both of those together, then it's at least somewhat of the right direction. So what I'm going to be exploring here is a little bit more about how that fits together. So the connection between the development of souls and the facilitation of processes of awakening. We have a call for ecologies of practices. So not only should we get together in groups and practice together, but we should practice in such a way that gives rise to emergent states of awareness, where we recognize that we are the space of relationship which is between us. And so the question then becomes about how the soul's development is tied to that, and what we can draw from the Neoplatonic tradition of Platonism and Neoplatonism applied in forms of religious practice called theurgy. How can those kinds of processes speak to us and inform us of how we ought to practice so as to wake ourselves up? That being understood as a necessary precondition for our continuation. It's really difficult to get into, to land an entire intro in one go, but I've given it a shot. As I attempt to ground down into the material, there are a couple of other bridging pieces that are necessary from that point. And one of them is the recognition that human consciousness is taking different forms One of those forms is the form of a midwife. We are literally taking the form of a kind of birth canal. So we are in the process of both uh, giving birth to as the mother, assisting that birth process as the midwife, and being born to ourselves as the child. And the thing about human consciousness is that different aspects of us, are taking each of those perspectives at the same time. Um, it seems to me that what is happening is a profound process of death and rebirth, which is giving rise to to a new form of consciousness, to a development or an evolution of consciousness that may be a remembering of something that was forgotten long ago, or it may be a genuine innovation. That's not so important. What's important is to get it right, because it's quite messy as a process. So from there, if we can understand that we're in the middle of a process of spiritual midwifery, then there's an obvious question of how exactly can we show up so as to support that development. Importantly, there are a couple of other qualities that go along with the process that I'm trying to describe. From my point of view, which is admittedly just one perspective, the process that we're talking about is a coming into consciousness of collective awareness. So, for example, I'll give one example, right? There's a notion, an idea that all of life is essentially one creature. And if you can imagine that as an idea, imagine that that being is coming into awareness of itself through human consciousness. So in some way, human consciousness is serving as an organ, as the consciousness of all of life. And partly for that reason, that it has to do with the coming into awareness of matter, of the earth. There's this quality of emergence from the depths. So what we're talking about is not a product of the human mind. It's not something which can be engineered. It's something that can be facilitated as one might midwife a birthing process. It's a natural, you could say natural phenomenon. While at the same time, like that's spiritual as well as natural, you could argue. What I want to say about that is if we can understand the relevance of the idea of an emergence from the depths, then I think we can also understand that it's something is emerging through us from the depths of our being. And whether we talk about that in terms of like emergence and emanation at the same time doesn't bother me so much. There's a kind of convergent process, and it's originating with something that is deeply not of the human rational cognitive faculties. And for me, this ties in the value of symbolic cognition. So this process is something that can be supported by what I would call access to the perspective of one's own soul. And by soul in this context, I simply mean that about one which is creative, unique, spontaneous, having to do with the quality of effortless effort, and yeah, improvisation, a childlike quality, a quality of being able to be who one really is, to be able to be authentic and to create from that place. This is what I mean by taking up the perspective of the soul. To me, it's from that perspective that this death and rebirth process is emerging. And so to me, it's Buckminster Fuller's quote, like criticized by creating, it's quite literally giving birth, genesis, to an entire new world, the world that is engendered by consciousness realizing itself, cosmogony. Now, I know that I just packed in a lot there, but what's important there is that there's a certain position, certain affordances are unlocked by being able to take up the perspective of one's own soul. And that's why I think this, uh, the Platonic paideia, the educational program going along with what comes out of the original academy, right? But combined with religious practice in the form of theurgic ritual worship is relevant because we're talking about the development of souls. We're talking about getting together and being able to take up the perspective of our souls all at once and to work together and to create together in that way. Now, let me try to be a little bit more specific. When we can inhabit and embody this perspective of our own soul, especially in group contexts that are creative, I feel that it affords us an opportunity to take on and off different identities. So this kind of phenomenon is seen a lot in, you know, traditional, or you could say indigenous forms of ceremony, where this capacity to become like an animal, for example, theriomorphism, or to become like the gods, or to become like another person, to become like anything, right? This capacity to take on a different perspective. In some ways, I think of that as a function of the soul. And so from there, what I'm attempting to talk about is that when we can uh, organize a particular ecology of practices in such a way that affords us access to the capacities of our own soul, for example, perspective taking, I think we can see how we can gain this or remember this capacity to uh, take the shape of the gods in theurgic terms. So in Viveki, this is the stuff about aspirational development. It's not just talking in dialogos about the virtues, the traditional Greek virtues. It's can we embody the gods? Can we uh, give rise to expressions of divinity, of the divine aspects of who we are in this world, in these lives, through these identities? So that is a distinctively theurgic question. So there's a connection here between becoming more aware of who we really are and taking the form or showing the qualities of the gods. Importantly, whether you call them gods or archetypes or imaginal presences, doesn't matter so much to me. What's important is that they're distinctly suprahuman identities that it is possible to give expression to. So in summary of this introduction here, the thesis is something like this. The process of collective awakening can be facilitated through developing the capacity to assume the perspective of the soul and to, through an ecology of practices, take on and take off archetypal identities. Another way to put that is that the soul, and in fact our souls, can enter into a reciprocal feedback loop that can bootstrap a collective awakening process by engaging from out of the perspective of the soul in dialectic with matter itself. And so from there, I am now going to go into chapter 4, Theurgy as Demiurgy, or taking the shape of the gods. So as I begin here, in this view of the human soul, there's a kind of spiritual hierarchy as well as a polytheism, where the human soul is one of the lowest divinities that has become entangled within matter. And we have forgotten who we truly are as a part of that process. So the idea is that we are actually our immortal souls, and that we can, through amanesis, remembering, recover that sense of who we are. But as we've become identified with these mortal lives, which are sustained by our souls, we lose our perspective of the whole, and we become absorbed into the flux of our mortal lives. And so recovering our true identity as souls through, I would say, through the individuation process, without anima possession for any Jungians following along at home, we can remember the perspective of the whole. So we come to, literally through remembering, amanesis, remembering who we really are, we get back in touch with not only wholeness, but being as the whole, rather than being stuck within our partiality. Part of the process that we're talking about here is that the soul comes to recognize the relativity of its own perspective in a way that is like it's like a counterpoint to the extended awareness that is coming into consciousness. So there's something about our consciousness which has become distinctly anthropocentric, focused within the person that we are. But can we recognize through this bootstrapping process that I've been trying to describe that we are also all of this? That we are, as I said, the consciousness organ for all of matter. So self-recognition as the commons. And the term for that, the commons or matter in the chapter, is hyle or hyle, which has several different functional equivalents: soma, phusis, and genesis. So soma as in somatic, as in the body. Phusis I won't go on about because I don't know enough about it. And genesis as in Genesis, the creation of a world. So this gives us this connection that when we can engage in this reciprocal opponent processing dialogue, feedback loop between our awareness as being souls and our awareness as matter, as embodied souls, then we can come to wake up as this, as the receptacle, as hyle, as soma, as genesis, as phusis, which are all equivalent. So what I'm talking about here is an awakening within matter that we recognize that we are. And so we are both receiving that process as matter and initiating, catalyzing that process as our conscious souls. Just to be more specific about that, that which is coming into awareness is a kind of silent, watchful, luminous presence, which is surrounding us and which is always here. And so the practice that I'm speaking about, involving an entire ecology of practices, is about speaking into that and invoking that, facilitating that, the emergence of that awareness. And the development of the process that gives rise to it. One of the first stages in this process is the initial recognition that we are not our embodiment, that we can get a positive, we can come to a positive view of what embodiment is by recognizing that we are immortal souls that are in these bodies for this time, but that the body which the soul animates is a kind of uh, quote, a circuit that the soul travels in order to be united with itself. So far from being a trap, that places chains around us in order to make us sleep and fall into unconsciousness. Matter is that, but when we wake up to that, we can also recognize embodiment itself and matter as an extension of embodiment as a kind of point of condensation in a long process that then becomes creative. So we've fallen into matter, we've forgotten who we really are, but we can remember that. We can remember our true nature by engaging with our embodiment, by engaging with matter, with the matter in a particular way. And that way is namely the way of theurgy. So Iamblichus describes this. Theurgy is able to, quote, cure souls of somatic identification. So rather than being identified with this mortal coil, we recognize our true nature as being souls. But through theurgic ritual practice, we can we are cured of our somatic identification by guiding ourselves into, quote, divinely sanctioned postures. So literally by taking the shape of the gods, as we were talking about. This supports us to recognize that we are not the mortal lives with which we are currently identified. We're far more than that, only we don't realize that we are. So theurgy is a practical form of religious practice involving specific rites and rituals that allows us to transform our quote unquote daimonic attractions to matter, our daimonic embeddedness in materiality, to transform those relations with matter into service of communion. And so one way to talk about the level of the spiritual hierarchy that's described as daimons, which are like spiritual forces of nature, in the theurgic tradition, is the impulses and instincts that tie us into our materiality. So, I mean, I won't go on about it, but just to say that the effect of these daimonic forces is gravitation. They bring us down into matter, into embodiment. And that can be seen in a malicious way as a kind of trap, but it doesn't have to be. Those forces are beneficent in the sense of tying us down into these lives, into this matter, which is profoundly beneficial, right? But we can transform such daimonic influence into the kind of transformation that allows us to commune with the gods. It's a little bit tricky to describe the inversion that I mean by that, but I'll leave it there for the moment. Essentially, what's being discussed is that theurgy is a kind of religious practice, which is essentially like spiritual alchemy. It's a way of turning the densest aspects of matter and our relations with matter into potential medicines for the soul, which has become diseased by the body. And so part of this sort of theurgic Neoplatonism is to give us a different perspective on what's going on in our lives, and not only what to do about it, but there's a sense that our souls have directed excessive attention to our bodies, such that we've become subject to fate. We've become subject to the rules which govern bodily activity in a phrase, which is not actually our true nature. And so this is a kind of condition that we've fallen into. They talk about the inversion of the soul. And in theurgic terms, what this means, what this implies, is that we have to become reconciled with the daimon that rules the particular realm of nature which governs our activity. So what we're talking about here is a ritual process through which the soul can achieve proper relations with the forces that tie the soul into materiality and into embodiment. I want to try and give an example of this because I'm conscious that this is extremely difficult to get a sense of what is actually being meant by this. Like it's very heady, very philosophical, very detached. So, for example, if we're wanting in group practice to be able to embody qualities like spontaneity and childlikeness and like group creativity and access states of flow, well, then if we're very easily getting triggered all the time, that's going to become very difficult. And so one way of uh, talking about like a therapeutic process or healing process in theurgic terms is to understand different emotions as different daimons. So, for example, people can be triggered by particular situations. Um, I'm struggling to think of an example right now, but just imagine that you are in a group context like that and you're triggered, and it brings up um, a lot of resentment. Well, part of what we would want to do theurgically is uh, work on the soul's relationship to resentment through that particular trigger or trailhead in IFS terms. So it would be about practicing um, working on our triggers such that we can do enough emotional work to release the soul's attachment to those, in a sense, dense expressions or you could say denser expressions of emotionality. So that rather than getting triggered by each other all the time, what we've done by working on ourselves in that way is to correct our relationship with those daimonic forces such that the soul is then available for the kind of process that I was trying to describe that has to do with sensitivity and creativity and spontaneity. So by correcting our relationship uh, with the forces that tie us to materiality, in this context understood as emotionality, the emotions, by working on that, we then unlock deeper capacity for collaboration and creativity. And once that's happened, I'm trying to talk a little bit here about what it actually means to practice communion in a theurgic way. And so what they talk about in theurgy, as at least as expressed by Gregory Shaw through Iamblichus, is ritual worship where a particular deity is invoked. So I'll use the example of Helios, the god of the sun in the Greek pantheon. So there would be, in a ritual context devoted to Helios, there would be particular people wearing particular clothes with particular herbs, particular stones, a particular song, and so on. There's a whole like paraphernalia of material objects that are in some way supposed to be associated with Helios. And the point here is that we can, like that archetypal quality is personified as a god. So we can understand that through Jung, right? Is that archetypal, uh, you could just simply say that archetype or that archetypal representation, it informs both the cosmos and our human souls. And so when the gods are understood in this as in this archetypal way, Um, what we see is that when we create a ritual context that is designed to facilitate communion with the gods, um, what's supposed to happen is that that collection of objects serves as a kind of receptacle or a vessel, because they, quote, preserve an intimate relation with the gods. What does that mean? Well, they bringing that collection of things together in that way is quite literally to create a symbol. Symbol meaning to gather together. So what we're talking about, a ritual process that deeply involves symbolic cognition. It's really difficult to talk about here, but what I'm getting at is that through the appropriate ritual use of what's called the god's sunthēmata, not sure how to pronounce that, but it's like, again, this paraphernalia associated with a particular archetypal quality. Through the appropriate use of such paraphernalia, the soul can awaken within itself the power of their corresponding symbols. Now, what do we mean by that? So there's a way that when a particular ritual context is created that involves particular objects, we can understand it sort of as devoted to a particular god, but it's more about devotion to a particular archetypal quality. And we can see that that archetypal quality, it manifests in the quote unquote external world and within our own characters. So that ritual context is designed to bring that quality out of ourselves. So, for example, in that ritual would be the quality of being like the sun god. You can imagine this in the ancient Greek context. We'll imagine that the people of Athens, they had something like this when it comes to Athena. They could, to some degree, embody and in that way worship Athena as Athenians, quite literally the spirit that was keeping them together as a polity. What's important to understand here is that the archetypal forces or gods that these ritual contexts are devoted to, these archetypes organize the cosmos, the universe, and the soul, our interiority. And these ritual contexts serve as a kind of portal, or literally like a receptacle or a bridge, an opening, through which we can connect with, in the depths of our soul, those archetypal qualities and embody them. Quote, this realigned the soul with the manifesting energies of a deity, archetype, and freed it from servitude to the daemons who watched over its physical expression. And here we can see how this kind of practice is derived in one strand from the Egyptian tradition. So Egyptian theology, where, for example, the idea of the pharaoh. The pharaoh is a kind of god king who literally serves in his person as a kind of bridge between the world of the archetypes, the world of the gods, and mortality. So that literally like the top of the pyramid, the guy at the top of the pyramid, the pharaoh, is the bridge, is the point of connection between Egyptian society and their imagined world of the gods. In the same way, this power in theurgy, right, which is a Neoplatonic, so a later, meaning more recent tradition, has become more democratized. So here we're talking about not just one guy, the pharaoh, but particular ritual contexts that facilitate the same kind of bridge, or again, midwifery. So to get a sense of what I mean here, imagine that it's not about gods, but instead about very basic archetypes, because this gives us a sense that is actually more accessible to our constrained modern imaginations, right? So imagine the archetypes of the mother, or the father, or the trickster, or the shadow, or the child. These are far more like readily available to our imagination. So then all you would have to do if you wanted to conduct a ritual to the mother is to gather a whole set of things that seem to be associated with the mother. Um, there are classical examples like literally a vessel because it's like a symbol of the mother expressed in material form. Or in the same way, like I'm thinking, for example, of the archetype of the witch, which is like a variant of the mother in its negative guise. Well, where does a witch live? Well, a witch kind of lives in I don't know, like in the swamp or in the forest, right? She doesn't live in a penthouse. That's like Peterson's example from long ago. But the point is that like if you were going to conduct a ritual that was about that archetype, you probably wouldn't do it in a penthouse because it doesn't make sense. The place and the materiality that's associated with that archetype is part of its expression. That's kind of what I mean when we talk about this sunthēmata, or literally like the materiality that are associated with different ruling gods or archetypes. And so their way of talking about this kind of what I was just saying, this like material objects that in a way embody different archetypal qualities. There's a very well-known example from Proclus of the heliotrope, which is quite literally like plants that grow toward the sun are heliotropic. And so Proclus puts it, quote, each thing prays according to the rank it occupies in nature. And so look, there's an idea here, which is that everything which there is, like this, like this, like this, all of these things that we see all around us, each of them is praying in its own way. And what do we mean by that? Well, each thing in a different way embodies and expresses certain archetypal qualities. And they do that to like better or worse degree, which one could talk about as a kind of rank. So, as Proclus says, quote, each thing prays according to the rank it occupies in nature, and sings the praise of the leader of the divine series to which it belongs. For the heliotrope moves to the extent that it is free to move, and in its rotation, if we could hear the sound of the air buffeted by its movement, we should be aware that it is a hymn to its king, such as it is within the power of a plant to sing. So what I'm talking about is the idea that prayer is actually embedded in the material world. And then when we bring together particular collections of things, objects, it's possible to reveal or get a better sense for the archetypal qualities that are collected in that symbol, in that gathering together. Because each of those material objects, if you imagine, they reveal different aspects or characteristics of the archetype in question. Just as another quick example, like if we go back to the example of the sun god Helios, well, there was a different collection of objects that at that time were regarded as embodying that archetypal quality. Namely the rooster, the lotus, the lion, and the bellstone. So imagine gathering those things together in such a way that gave you a better sense of Helios being present. Well, we don't have to believe in Helios to see how a collection of things that we regard as associated with the mother might give us a better sense for that particular archetype if we were to actually practice in that way. Importantly, we're not talking about idolatry here. We're not talking about worship of actual material objects. We're talking about worship by way of material objects, which is quite literally iconography, not idolatry. And so there's a way that, according to people like Iamblichus, the sense is that the gods, or we could say the archetypes, they give soul to soulless things. And in this way, soulless things, or literally like objects, can give us a sense for communion. Quote, that things without intelligence should be vehicles of divine wisdom, followed a principal tenet of theurgy that communion with the gods did not take place through man's mental efforts or power. So again, this is not the kind of thing that we can engineer. It's not a matter of, in a sense, rational reflection, although it can be understood as a rational process. It's a process of communion, which is quite literally something deeper than our intellect. It's a kind of embodying or participation in the archetypal or the divine. So there are two important points to make in passing here. One of them is that this goes along with a critique of the human intellect. So part of Iamblichus's whole like theurgic, like he's really pushing this ritual stuff on us, is that there's an over-rationalization, like an over-intellectuality, an excessive intellectualization that we see in Platonic circles. It's not just about philosophy, it's about embodied participation, enacting communion with the divine. And that's not something that we achieve through the power of the intellect. And so the theurgic way of understanding that is that these theurgic rituals that we've been talking about are actually a result of divine action, not human action. So it's a way of understanding that the archetypes themselves actually speak through us and give rise to these contexts. It's not something that we create, although our agency is clearly involved. The other point I wanted to make is that there's the connection to the Pythagorean stuff here. So in terms of Pythagoras, last time we were talking about this arithmoi, or these archetypes of number, which express themselves in the form of ratio, in the form of harmonics, in the form of geometry, and in the form of number. But there are archetypes of number which are sort of number is one expression of them, literally called arithmoi in Pythagorean terms. And so what we can see here is that as part of these theurgic rituals, there are certain melodies and rhythms, quote, that give the soul direct participation in the gods. So this is a distinctly Pythagorean way where through sound, through harmony, through resonance, through particular melodies and rhythms, we're able to embody and like through our embodiment, access communion, literally direct participation in the divine, where those melodies, you could say frequencies, but it's about more than that. They again serve as this bridge, this connecting link between that which is regarded as archetypal or divine and our frailty, our human mortality. And so this combination of, yeah, what are called sunthēmata, these material objects, they are expressions of that archetypal quality. They, quote unquote, they bear the impression of the gods. And because of that, they're able to awaken human souls, embodied souls, to the divinity which they symbolize. We can see just in passing there the clear connection from the role of music and rhythmic speech in this kind of practice. There's a clear link back to shamanism and shamanic speech, for example, in the essay which I published a couple of videos on, Henry Munn, The Mushrooms of Language, talks a lot about shamanic speech in this context, which is taken in Christianity into speaking in tongues, glossolalia. And so this is a way of reimagining Plato's divine madness, where it's a way of reinterpreting what possession means through music or rhythmic speech. So it can be like the essential quote here is that the mystic swims in the same waters in which the schizophrenic drowns. So rather than being the crazy rantings of a madman, which maybe sometimes they are, it's that kind of musicality or rhythmic speech, glossolalia, shamanic speech can be a means of accessing the divine. We see an example of this among the Peruvians, the shamans in Peru, in Amazon and elsewhere. They they speak, they sing. In fact, the songs, Icaros, are an important part of the healing process that gets involved uh, in shamanism involving ayahuasca, for example. I won't go on about that, but just to mention in passing, this is a way of re-understanding possession in a different way. So according to this kind of view of these ritual contexts, like the occasions of theurgic worship, religious practice in theurgic terms, anything that receives these archetypal forces and mediate their presence function as this kind of sacred receptacle that we've been trying to discuss. And so whether it's like literally material objects like stones or like collections of particular objects or involving a particular song, but it can also involve particular visions and these all function as what we were talking about earlier as hyle or hyle. So they serve as a receptacle or a vessel for that archetype. And so even a particular vision, like a particular visionary image, can serve as a kind of vessel, as a you could say as a representation of the libido, the energy that is expressed from the archetype into the vision. So a visionary imagery or revelation is a way that we receive as a vessel that which is transcendent or beyond. When we understand that visionary imagery can be part of this process, this takes us straight back to the psychology of religious experience. Through William James and through Jung, we understand that mystical experience through the shamanic traditions and throughout the world traditions is the way in which people of all ages have experienced the divine. And so we're talking about that same process, but ritually reenacted, much as happened at the Oracle of Delphi, which all the Greeks were all up in. So I'm going to attempt to move relatively quickly through the rest of the chapter, which is rather long. There's a connection here to the work of Henry Corbin with the imaginal and the imaginal world. So importantly, when we like learn and develop the capacity to receive visionary imagery of the kind that we've been talking about, when we develop this capacity for mystical experience, for revelation through specific ritual practices, our experience of the world, of matter and embodiment, then changes. And Corbin's way of talking about this is that we inhabit the imaginal world. So we see the world in an ensouled or imaginal way. And so according to people like Iamblichus, that's a process of the purification of the soul. So through theurgic rituals, our soul becomes increasingly purified so that our experience of matter becomes less like the experience of matter seen in Plato's Phaedo and more like the cosmological matter seen in the Timaeus. And practically what that means is that we start to see the entire world, the world itself, as one immense receptacle, one immense vessel, which reveals the will of the gods. So from this theurgic perspective, the cosmos itself ends up being seen as a temple. So all of this is a temple. Well, what happens in a temple? Well, it's a kind of sacred space where people of all times and ages, right, have connected with that which is transcendent or beyond or divine. When we understand the whole world that way, imagine how that would change our way of living. So we're talking here about the reenchantment or reensoulment of the world. We're also talking about cosmogony in the sense that through a process of inner transformation, the purification or development of the soul, we come to give birth to a new world, which quite literally in this context means taking up a new perspective on the world. There's also a connection just in passing here to Heidegger and the stuff from building, dwelling, thinking about homemaking and being in the world in terms of creating a temple. But I'll leave Heidegger to the side. So in this way of practice, what we attain, at least along part of the way, is the kind of perspective that sees that everything, the whole universe and the soul, it participates in receiving. So in a way, it's a metaphysics of listening. It's a way that quote, insofar as anything is receptive to an informing principle, it is matter or hyle with respect to that principle. So what I'm talking about there is like everything is this luminous, aware, receiving vessel, this stillness or silence that precedes everything. So it's a self-recognition as the ocean of consciousness that precedes all the content of consciousness. So the principle here is that this hyle that we were talking about, which is also soma, phusis, and genesis, is transposable. We can see it everywhere, all through ourselves, through our material body, and through the material world. Okay, so now I'm going to try to express one of the paradoxes that is sort of implied by this kind of religious practice. And that is to do with this, like the paradox of embodiment again. So what this kind of practice does is it preserves our natural order in the universe. What it does is it preserves the link between our souls and embodiment or matter, because we literally express the divine through us and see the world, experience the world in an ensouled and reenchanted imaginal way. So it very much preserves the continuity between our divinity and our natural or material aspect or quality. But other than embedding us down in nature in that way, the other one is that these kind of rituals and rites are empowered by divine symbols, which we've talked about. And through those symbols, through those gatherings together, we are then raised up. We are raised up through those symbols to communion with the divine or archetypal, which we can talk about as taking the shape of the gods. And so what this means is that theurgy is a kind of ritual practice that allows us to embody and connect with our limitation, our mortality, our materiality, our fatedness, at the same time as connecting with our divinity, our superhuman quality, our archetypal aspects, or the eternal. And we do that at the same time, which is paradoxical. If I talk about that in terms of the soul, what we're talking about here is we direct the powers of our particular soul, our particular microcosm, into alignment with the powers of the world soul, which gives us a sense of direct participation in the whole. So the way that I would talk about that is with the archetype or the image of Indra's net, which is like a lattice work of jewels, which is kind of an expression of what Paul Tillich described as this duality, dialectic between individuation and participation. So as we go deeper into the expression of our own souls, we regain our access to wholeness through reconnecting with the world soul. Direct participation in the whole. So in that way of ritual practice, we become both universal and divine, but also particular and mortal. And again, just in passing here, I'm about to express one of the more, or what I find to be difficult aspects of this kind of theory. There is perceived to be a kind of vehicle for the soul, which is not the physical body, which is more like a subtle body or imaginal body. And I don't quite know how to get a grasp of this phenomena yet, but it's the idea of the soul vehicle. So it's the idea that the soul has a kind of quote star body, which is visualized as a sphere. So it's referred to as a kind of vehicle or breath. It's a kind of means of the soul. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to say that apparently the relevance of this is that through theurgic ritual practice, there's a kind of purifying light which is shone by the gods or by the archetypes. And through that theurgy, the embodied soul is purified and so freed of its particularity and Another way to say that, freed of its particularity, is that it's restored into the vehicle of the soul. Um, so yeah, there's a capacity for movement, for transformation, for capacity of the soul, which is unlocked. I'm thinking of soul flight from a shamanic context. So one way of understanding this is that our soul has become grounded, has become immobilized, like embedded in matter. And that as we recover our sense of who we really are, we regain access to the dynamism and capacity for literally like transport as well as transformation that seems to go along with um, the purification of the soul. That's all the time I'm going to spend on that. They talk about it as a kind of a way of embodying the cosmos at a microcosmic level because these vehicles of the soul are understood as a luminous and spherical vehicle within which the theurgist receives visions and is unified with the gods. But I have to try and understand what more is meant by the vehicle of the soul to really be able to get a grasp on that. So I'm going to leave that there. One of the other purposes of being able to come into this kind of expression, literally to like reconnect with the source, reconnect with our wholeness, is that we gain the capacity to imitate the demiurge in the sense of embodying the creator. I won't go on about that, but just to say that when we can embody the creativity that that kind of reconnection with wholeness gives us access to, then that creativity can allow us to enact the activity, enact the joining of parts with the whole. So it's not just ourselves that are afforded this reconnection with the whole. It's all everything that we relate with is given a way to reconnect from its partial nature to the whole. So we're talking about restoring wholeness, not only within our identities, but within our practice, within the world itself. So rather than having this whole division of many, 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 many things that are all separated from each other, it's something that's a little more right hemispheric. It's being able to reintegrate all of these objects into the sense of being one, the sense of wholeness. As Plato says about individual souls, that they exist in order that blissful existence be secured for the life of the whole. Not for your sake was the world generated, but you were born for its sake. So this is a way of reconnecting with the essence of human purpose, that our purpose here is to, quote unquote, bring order to the world, bring harmony back to matter by reconnecting all the matter that we see with, like, reintegrating all of that with wholeness. I could talk more about what I mean by that, but I think I'll leave that for another time. It's distinctly phenomenological. We can see that the meaning of theurgy here in the history of Platonism, it's clear that like it's a kind of praxis that allows souls to move from the experience of embodiment being an isolating prison to embodiment being a way to participate in the world soul, where the particularity of our individual souls are re-established within the unity of the whole. Another way to talk about that is to re-enter the community of the gods, quote, as one of its bodies of light. And this means that we're no longer alienated by matter, nor passionately drawn to it. So embodiment is transformed from a kind of chaotic influence of suffering into a kind of um, adornment or raiment of the divine. Yeah, so in theurgy, the soul gradually transforms the chaos of its embodied experience into the quote, the perfect measures of the cosmos. This also implies that theurgy is a process of soul development. So where the theurgy is a kind of understood as like a gradual path of lifelong labor that involves building a kind of divine body, where matter then reflects the condition of the soul. I won't talk too much about that here, but just to say that there is this mirroring between self and world, where materiality is understood to be a reflection of what's happening within us. There's a key emphasis on not only the skill, but our participation in receptivity. Like it's not just a skill, it's something, it's more like an existential condition of being able to receive deeply. So, quote, the intensity of the soul's contact with the gods is in direct proportion to its receptive capacity. The more that we can receive divinity or archetypal forces, the more we can embody them, the more intense that contact is. Matter then ends up being seen as a kind of necessary vehicle through which souls were divinized. So it may be the case that matter itself is the one of the bodies of the soul. I'm not sure yet. But anyway, there's a good analogy here. So Shaw says, the material principle represent sorry, this is in relation to one of the original Egyptian hieroglyphs, which again, a kind of symbolic language, which is much deeper than our discursive intellect and our discursive form of language. So it's the hieroglyph of a young god seated on a lotus. And he says, the material principle represented by the mud under the lotus serves as the foundation to nourish the lotus until it develops a circular throne for the god. Just so, each embodied soul rooted in the mud of embodiment and the waters of psychic change is nourished by this very condition until it's capable of receiving God. And so I'll just finish this off with a couple final quotes here. So the matter of the Phaedo, with all its negative effects, was revealed progressively to the theurgists as the matter of the Timaeus, which is far more positive view of matter. So again, these different, more pessimistic and then optimistic views of matter are understood of as different perspectives appropriate to different levels of soul development. But this is the case only by virtue of the theurgists themselves becoming, quote, demiurgic and ritually enacting the eternal measures established in creation. What we talked about earlier in connection with Pythagoras to do with harmony, music. The perfection of the theurgist as the soul, the perfection of the soul, was realized only by assimilating oneself to the world, coordinating our particular attractions, somatic or intellectual, with their causal principles, the forms which literally inform the world. Quote, as the lowest divinity, the human soul achieves its highest condition only when it was conscious of being lowest, for only then did it realize its place in the divine hierarchy. Quote, when the soul's receptacles were cleansed of the accretions added in embodiment, then it can become a, quote, proper receptacle of the gods, and like the pure matter of the Timaeus, transfer this order to the phenomenal world. The perfect theurgist becomes an embodiment of the Platonic Demiurge, whose presence was enough to create harmony out of discord and drive away evil. Finishing this off here, Iamblichus says, every vice and every passion is entirely removed by theurgists, for a pure participation in the good is present with the pure, and they are filled from on high with the fire of truth. Okay, it's a little bit dramatic. For theurgists, there is no impediment from evil spirits, nor are there hindrances to the goodness of the soul. Nor does any affectation or flattery or the enjoyment of vapors or violent force annoy them. But all these, as if struck by lightning, yield and recede without touching the theurgists, nor can they even approach them. So it's a kind of full integration of materiality and embodiment. Quote, having situated his particularity into the circle of the whole, The theurgist was immune from particular threats in precisely the same way as the gods. So again, it's a way of taking the form of the gods. In imitation of divine beings, the body of the theurgist becomes a vehicle through which the gods appeared to the physical world and through which he received their communion. Okay, and that will quite do with chapter 4, Theurgy as Demiurgy, in part 1 of Gregory Shaw's Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. I obviously have to come back at different points and try to talk more about the connection between gods and archetypes, archetypal awareness, and collective awakening. The links are still not quite clear, but one video at a time, one day at a time, one step at a time. Bringing this into an actual ecology of practices is, for me, where the edge is. That's what I'm going to be doing. I'll continue with part 2, which is the nature of the embodied soul.